exorcist, a forgotten girl in Romania began to bleed from nothing. This is not the story you think you know. It's not about holy water or twisted heads. It's about a child, a mystery, and the terrifying moment when fear itself becomes a physical force. And the most disturbing part? The closer they looked, the less they understood. This is a story that begins in shadows and ends in silence. A journey into a historical haunting that refuses to be easily explained or dismissed. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most terrifying entities are not demons from a pit, but the ones we construct from our own collective dread and desperate need for an answer, any answer, to the unbearable chaos of suffering. For centuries, people have reported being seized by something not themselves. Our histories, both sacred and secular, are filled with these moments, where communities, faced with the unexplainable, reached for the only words they had: demon, spirit, possession. These words were tools, a desperate language for the unspeakable, a way to draw a circle around chaos and name the monster in the dark. But what happens when that story, that monstrous narrative, is written not in ancient texts, but on the fragile skin of a child? When the vessel for a community's deepest fears is a young girl who cannot understand what is happening to her, let alone why the world has suddenly turned its frightened, feverish gaze upon her. This is the terrible pivot point where folklore becomes lived reality, and a personal nightmare escalates into a public spectacle. Today, we go to a remote village in 1920s Romania, to a case that captivated scientists, horrified the devout, and fed the voracious appetite of newspapers before vanishing, almost completely, into silence. This is the story of Eleanor Zugun. They called her the Devil's Girl, a label that stuck to her like a brand. And for a brief, terrifying time, as objects flew and wounds opened on command, they may have believed they were right. Her tale is a cornerstone of modern paranormal history, yet it is also a profound human tragedy, a case study in how easily empathy can be replaced by examination, and how a search for truth can become a form of exploitation. Her world was one of ancient soil and older superstitions, a place where time moved to the rhythm of the seasons and the rituals of the church. Life in Talpa was hard, unyielding, governed by the solemn rites of the Romanian Orthodox faith and the older, darker whispers of folk magic that lingered in the deep forests and in the stories told by firelight. Here, the line between a blessing and a curse was perilously thin. A neighbor's envy could manifest as the evil eye. A strange illness might be the work of a witch's spell. This was not mere fantasy, it was a framework for understanding misfortune, a cosmology that gave shape to random tragedy. It was into this deeply resonant, spiritually charged atmosphere that Eleanor was born in 1913. Her early life was simple and arduous, marked by the poverty common to peasant families and the relentless work required to survive. There was little room for whimsy, and even less for deviations from the norm. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the small disturbances began. It was the little things, the sort of events you could almost explain away if you tried hard enough. A ceramic cup would slide a bare inch on the wooden table, as if nudged by an unseen elbow. A plate would shift with a faint scrape when no one was standing near it. A mirror was found one morning, with a delicate spiderweb of cracks radiating from its center, though no one in the household had heard the telltale sound of breaking glass. The family's initial reactions were practical, rooted in the mundane. They blamed drafts sneaking through the old walls, uneven floorboards causing furniture to settle, or simply a clumsy child not paying attention. Eleanor, they reasoned, must be the cause. But then the noises started, and the explanations grew thinner. There were knocks, not from the door, but from inside the heavy kitchen cupboard where the pots were stored, a hollow, deliberate sound that seemed to answer no external stimulus. On another occasion, a wooden chair was heard scraping distinctly across the floorboards on its own, dragging just an inch or two before stopping, as if someone had bumped it from behind in an empty room. The mood in the house began to shift, a slow seep of unease replacing irritation. And then came the definitive, inexplicable moment, the day a metal spoon, resting on a sideboard, suddenly flew across the room as if thrown with considerable force, striking the plaster wall with a sharp clang before clattering to the floor. No one was near it. No vibration could explain it. That sound marked the end of normality. The atmosphere in the small home changed irrevocably. What was odd became unnerving, and what was unnerving began to feel genuinely threatening. Eleanor, now the obvious focal point, insisted with increasing desperation that she wasn't touching anything, that she was as confused and frightened as they were. Her fear seemed authentic, a raw terror that was painful to witness. Then came the stones, an escalation that defied all rational explanation. Pebbles and small rocks would materialize inside the tightly sealed house, appearing as if from nowhere to clatter and bounce across the floor. They seemed to target no one and everyone, a chaotic, physical manifestation of the growing chaos. And then, the marks. This was the turning point from strange disturbance to visceral horror. Eleanor began to complain of being pinched, scratched, and slapped by invisible hands. At first her family was skeptical, attributing it to a child's imagination or perhaps a rash. Then they saw the evidence with their own eyes. Long, thin, angry-looking welts would rise on her arms, her face, her back, precise, linear marks as if carved by unseen fingernails. The most chilling accounts describe these scratches appearing slowly, over the course of seconds or minutes, in full view of horrified witnesses. It was a violation that was both intimate and spectacular. Her pain was writing itself on her skin for all to see, a cryptic and brutal message no one could decipher. A local Orthodox priest was called, his presence a reflex in a community where spiritual threats required spiritual solutions. He performed prayers, sprinkled holy water, and attempted to bless the home and the girl. By multiple accounts, his efforts did not calm the situation. If anything, the phenomena seemed to intensify in defiance, as if provoked by the ritual. The feeling of siege was now complete. Confused, terrified, and likely fearing for their own safety as much as hers, her family made a momentous decision. They sent her away. It was an act of desperation that they believed would protect their home, but it was a decision that would catapult Eleanor from a local mystery into the blinding light of an international spectacle. Her private haunting was about to become public property. In 1925, her case came to the attention of a researcher in the city of Czernowitz, a man named Fritz Grunewald. He represented a new, modern approach to the ancient problem of the paranormal. He wasn't an exorcist seeking to cast out a demon. He was a psychic investigator, a man of the emerging 20th century who wanted to observe, to measure, to document. To him, Eleanor was no longer primarily a victim to be saved through faith, but a fascinating phenomenon to be studied through empirical means. She was transitioning from a possessed girl to a human laboratory. And critically, the phenomenon followed her. It did not stay in Talpa. It clung to her, a terrifying and inseparable companion. In Grunewald's care, the disturbances not only continued, but evolved. Objects flew with more force and frequency. A heavy glass inkwell was reported to have hurled itself at a wall, narrowly missing a visiting priest. Furniture rattled and shifted, And the scratches kept coming, now sometimes forming in strange, rudimentary symbols, crosses, arrows, shapes that hinted at a malicious intelligence. This development captured wider attention. Word reached the sophisticated circles of Vienna, where a wealthy and formidable figure, Countess Zoe Wasilko-Serecki, took a keen interest. The Countess, a prominent figure in early parapsychology, ran an institute dedicated to studying just such anomalies. She arranged for Eleanor to be brought to the Austrian capital. The girl from the peasant village was now a live experiment at a metropolitan scientific institute. A transition so jarring it is difficult to fully comprehend. In Vienna, under what were touted as controlled, clinical conditions, the attacks reportedly intensified. The phenomena seemed to adapt to its new, more scrutinized environment. Typewriters were said to operate without human touch. A small crucifix was witnessed flying from a wall. Researchers, armed with the latest technology, took hundreds of photographs of Eleanor. The most controversial images purported to show fresh wounds forming in real time on her body, welts rising on her skin between one flashbulb pop and the next. Throughout this ordeal, observers noted the girl's demeanor as being strangely stoic, often disconnected. She seemed to retreat inwards, as if her mind was elsewhere even as her body was under visible assault. This dissociation would later become a key piece of the psychological puzzle. News of the haunted girl could not be contained within laboratory walls. The press, always hungry for a sensational story, descended. They dubbed her the Devil's Girl, a headline-ready name that stripped her of humanity and replaced it with Gothic menace. Newspapers across Europe screamed about the demonic child from the Carpathians. Cartoonists crudely sketched her with horns and a tail. She was transformed from a suffering individual into a symbol, a global curiosity trapped in a vicious triangle of cold science, fervent spirituality, and sheer, unfeeling exploitation. She was a Rorschach test for the age, and everyone saw their own fears and theories reflected in her story. But what was really happening? As the spectacle grew, the experts fractured into vehement, opposing camps. The traditionalists believed fully in a poltergeist, an external, non-human, and malicious force that had attached itself to the girl. This was a classic, spirit-centric explanation. Others, however, were developing radical new theories that pointed the finger not outward, but inward. The most prominent voice in this new school was the Hungarian-born researcher Nandor Fodor. Studying the case from afar and through reports, Fodor saw not a demon, but trauma. He proposed a revolutionary idea. Eleanor was an unconscious agent. Her deep, unexpressed psychological distress, a compound of poverty, family disruption, cultural fear, and the massive shock of her upheaval, was somehow being projected outward, affecting the physical world through a process he called exteriorized neurotic energy. In this framework, the poltergeist was not an invading entity, but a symptom. It was a psychic scream made manifest, a desperate, uncontrolled expression of pain that took the form of flying objects and self-inflicted wounds, all generated without her conscious intent. Was the haunting not an invasion from hell, but a terrible, violent eruption from the deepest wells of the human psyche? This concept blurred all previous lines. If true, it meant her own mind was making its suffering undeniably, violently real in a way that commanded attention when words perhaps failed. Skeptics, of course, cried fraud. They argued it was an elaborate hoax, perhaps orchestrated by the adults around her for money or fame. Yet, even the most ardent debunkers struggled to explain the events that occurred under close watch by multiple observers, or the appearance of wounds on parts of her body she could not physically have reached on her own. The girl was frequently searched, her nails kept short. The mystery resisted a simple solution. For nearly 2 years, Eleanor Zugun was tested, photographed, debated, and displayed. And then, as public fascination is wont to do, the world's attention waned. A new sensation arose. The funding for studies dried up. The headlines stopped. As quickly as the international storm had gathered, it dissipated, leaving silence in its wake. By 1927, the bizarre circus had left town. Eleonore returned to Romania and faded completely from public view. She lived out the remainder of her life in obscurity, reportedly working as a seamstress. The girl who had bled for the newspapers, who had been probed by scientists and sensationalized by journalists, simply disappeared back into the anonymous fabric of ordinary life. She left no memoirs, gave no interviews. The silence she maintained after the storm is perhaps the most eloquent part of her entire story. So, what are we to make of Eleanor Zugun's story a century later? It endures as a profound and unsettling mystery, but perhaps its greatest power lies not in proving the supernatural, but in serving as a stark blueprint for how society handles the inexplicable suffering of the vulnerable. Her case prefigures and embodies the phantom that haunts our modern understanding of such events. The Enfield poltergeist, the case of Tina Resch in Ohio, and others. The pattern is hauntingly familiar. A young person, often on the cusp of adolescence, becomes the epicenter of a storm of unexplained physical events. Around them, a frantic search for answers unfolds. A search that inevitably reveals more about the searcher's beliefs, biases, and cultural moment than it does about the core truth of the experience. Was it a discarnate spirit? An unprecedented psychic explosion of subconscious pain? A complex, sustained hoax born of a need for attention in a bleak world? The evidence, fragmented and filtered through the lens of time and bias, allows for all three interpretations. We may never know with certainty what transpired in that Romanian cottage and those Viennese laboratories. But the enduring power of her story forces a haunting, uncomfortable question onto us, the audience. In our relentless need to categorize, to explain away the frightening and the strange, what do we sacrifice? What if, when faced with the terrifying abyss of the unknown, the first monster we so eagerly identify and pursue is not a ghost or a demon, but the victim themselves? We turn them into a symbol, a case study, a devil's girl, because it is easier to fear or analyze a monster than to sit with the profound, complicated, and often unresolved agony of another human being. Her legacy, therefore, isn't found in proven ghosts or validated paranormal events. It resides in the unsettling, ambiguous space she permanently occupies, a living question mark etched into the history of human fear. Before Linda Blair's head spun, before the name The Exorcist meant an Oscar-winning film, there was a frightened, real girl from Talpa. And for a short, horrifying while, the whole world watched, debated, and consumed the spectacle as something, whether from within or without, tore at her from a place no one could truly see or understand. If you were fascinated by this journey into the shadows where history, psychology, and mystery violently collide, if you appreciate deep dives into the stories that linger at the edges of our understanding, then do the Channel Winds of Thought a huge favor. Hit the like button below. It genuinely helps us continue to explore these complex and haunting tales. Your engagement allows us to dig deeper, to shine a light on other forgotten chapters, and to keep questioning the stories we think we know. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important truth is not the answer we find, but the question we learn to ask.